And I also am coming to you today, as all my colleagues are, from what today has been an incredibly chilly lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples. But I will start by paying my respects to their elders past and present, and then extending that respect and acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are listening to this today. We do live on lands with some of the most sophisticated and the deep approaches to cultural memory and knowledge management have been developed. And for me, whenever talking about cultural memory, it's important to have that dose of humility in thinking about the systems that our professions are so proud of and we'll be discussing today in comparison to the depth and understanding of systems on the country that we live. I do want to thank the organisers today for the opportunity. As my bio stated, UTS is where I learned the basics of librarianship. I have noticed that there are far too many of my former teachers online for comfort at this point, and I will not be attempting to quote any philosophers. What I do want to do, and I think it will work quite nicely actually thinking about what my colleagues have talked about, is to talk about the concepts of comprehensive collecting and why I think that part of the cultural memory is so important. Comprehensive collecting is an issue which is at the heart of the establishment and the role of the National Library. As I'm sure most of you do know, the National Library of Australia collects a copy of every published work in Australia, in theory at least. That covers not only the obvious candidates like books and serials from publishing houses and media companies, but it also covers government publications, community newsletters, posters, and even ephemeral publications from your junk mail right through to menus. For the latter, we obviously only collect samples, but we do that quite systematically in many cases. So, for example, the annual collection of a Bunnings catalogue goes back in some form to our 1920s collection of an independent hardware store catalogue and creates a very consistent record over a long period of time. Comprehensive collecting is both, I think, an astounding thing. There's always some smart aleck who can find the 2 or 3 things in our catalogue that we haven't collected, and please don't contribute in the chat field, although do let me know afterwards. But it's also an expected thing. Of course, we should keep a record of everything that occurs in the public sphere in Australia. The concept, the role of a national library across certainly most of the world that's been influenced by Europe actually does come out of the European Enlightenment, and the idea of what the public sphere is and what importance of recording the events in the public sphere actually relates to an understanding of how society works. But in its modern form, a comprehensive collection, a collection that takes a copy of everything that is eligible for that, has allowed us to interrogate history and to understand who we are in an ever-evolving way that is perhaps quite different to what the original intention has achieved. By comprehensively collecting a form of publication, librarians abstain from judging, curating, or interpreting those events. We make sure instead that what we've collected is something that enables a future generation to interrogate on their own terms what it was that was being discussed or debated. It is important to critique the assumptions that are inherent in that. There's an elitism to the focus on publication, and that does inherently determine whose story is being preserved. There's also a question which I'll refer to as I talk through about what is prioritised for collection and how it comes in. But it's really important to understand how this has created space for future generations to tell stories that they wouldn't have been able to have told if the institutions had only done curated collecting, which Jackie spoke about very powerfully. I think for me, one of the finest examples of this is encapsulated by the Newcastle University Colonial Frontier Massacres map. This project is only one of many working in this space, but the team there used public records, largely those held by the National Library of Australia and made accessible through Trove, to reconstruct the frontier violence of Australia's colonisation and settlement. These records are not coming from oral histories, although those memories are well preserved through Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander systems that I talked about at the start. But these come largely from published accounts that have disappeared from view. In an era when acknowledging the existence of such massacres was unpopular, the accounts vanished from the grand narrative, from the curated collections, and from the ways that we spoke about our history. but the complete preservation of newspapers, newsletters, journals, bulletins, even the diaries that have come in, have ensured that that record has simply been waiting to be rediscovered. A more recent example for me is our Jewish Newspapers project. This was an initiative from the National Library of Australia and has been carried out with the assistance of the National Library of Israel and the Australian Jewish Historical Society, among many others. Through that project, we've recently found and digitised and preserved, in some cases, Australia's rich history of Jewish serial publications. In doing this, one of the things that we discovered was that many of the newspapers that at the time we had brought in and catalogued as being Hebrew language are in fact Yiddish language. That happens quite a lot because what it indicates is that the librarians at the time, and we're talking here about the 1920s, didn't have enough understanding of the language to determine what the script was that they were, to determine what the language was that they were looking at. The other big finding we've had already out of producing that was that there was a much stronger regional presence of Jewish people within Australia from a very early age rather than just the metropolitan piece. The project has enabled us to recover items that weren't around and where we didn't have the expertise and the process in-house. Comprehensive collecting isn't just about creating new narratives at a history level though. It's also about allowing people to find themselves in the archive. This for me is a big part of the way that a national library and the archives has a very similar role in some ways, and certainly the National Film and Sound Archive, as it moves into futures, does as well. But we don't necessarily always have to look at representation as the only purpose of the archive. Part of the purpose of the archive is to allow each individual to trace themselves back into the record of the history of the nation. Sometimes in GLAM institutions, we can be dismissive of those that I like to describe as recreational researchers, people who are looking up their family history or who are powering the local history societies in small towns, or people who are just looking for a picture of the house that they just moved into. Trove, the library's initiative to make our newspapers, almanacs, other records, increasing their archival material easily searchable online, has largely unlocked these collections for casual observers, and that amateur researcher is our large base of support. This kind of activity, I think, provides a really strong bridge between our characterisation of history, our understanding, and the ways that people who lived in it engage with it. People who come in and are able to find something that relates directly to their own life in the archive and their own sense of self provide a narrative bridge between the big ways that we think about history and those divergent conversations and discussions within the process. Craig, at the conclusion of his presentation, talked about our need to move towards divergent and conflicting views of history. But I think part of the purpose of cultural memory institutions that can do large-scale collecting is that those stories have always been allowed to are always allowed to exist, as long as we can provide an equality of access to them. They create a sense of national identity which doesn't have to tell a single story and is also deeply personally meaningful to all of those who engage in them. One of the examples that I might mention here too, to provide a sense of that, is a project that was carried out by the Tin Shed Museum up in Cherbourg, who took, again, examples from archives both at the National Library and the Australian War Memorial, another one of our national cultural institutions, to provide a virtual reality display to the local high school kids on their association with relatives who'd served in the First World War. For me, this was a really amazing and interesting project, not only because it was a really useful use of virtual technologies, which I think can be quite difficult to use effectively in cultural memory institutions, but also because it was an initiative which found ways of using all of that element of hidden histories. They used genealogy and recreational researchers to identify which of the soldiers that served did in fact have Indigenous heritage, because most had lied about it in order to be able to serve at that point in time. They were able to use the accessibility of our archive to create a really rich visual and immersive experience. And they were able to very directly connect the experiences of racism of earlier generations to the experiences of youth today to create a sense of identity and understanding of the role in the nation, which is really what cultural memory needs to be about. Those are the kinds of projects that I think reiterate the importance not only of having our carefully curated and thought through collections, but in establishing and maintaining a mandate that we will try to keep a copy of what appears in the public sphere, and having methods of collecting that enable future generations to get around some of those curatorial decisions made by the staff at libraries and institutions. All right, I will try and speed up. Conscious we just hit 7. There are enormous challenges. The others have spoken about that, but I think looking into the future for cultural memory, some of what we need to do to make sure we can provide those kinds of collections for future generations are quite challenging. Obviously, publication of a huge range of formats has moved entirely to a digital format, and collecting of digital is a really large part of what all of the NCIs are doing. For the National Library, I will just flag the web archive that we've created. This was an early initiative, and when I say early, I'll point out that its existence was one of the reasons that I wanted to take a job at the library in 2006, that takes a static snapshot of a web page and makes it accessible. That process of being able to collect something digital and think it through has both highlighted the huge value of our new collecting mechanisms, but also the beginning of what really has been in the last 2 decades, a major shift away from the traditional barriers between a public and a private sphere, and a large shift of public communication, debate and existence into what is increasingly a corporate owned sphere online, which has posed enormous challenges for us in terms of how we would collect and record that memory into the future. The other blurring of a distinction that I'd argue has raised real challenges for our profession is that between permanent information and ephemeral information. We've obviously always collected ephemeral information as part of a publication output, but we're very much faced now with, because of those twin blurrings, this concept that much of what people put out about themselves into the public sphere is not intended to be permanent or kept. When we see legislation in Europe like the right to be forgotten, which is a protection of the way that people's privacy moves forward, we're also conscious that those kinds of legislation would make much of what our collective memory institutions do impossible. And certainly it makes it far more challenging to work out how we can both collect and provide access to digital into the future. We have enormous technical challenges. Our institutions are not well geared to innovate digitally at the level which we need to make sure that even if we had all of those issues sorted out, we can continue to collect digitally. The cybersecurity issues. These are less around the loss of content. People often worry significantly about the loss of digital content, but I'd point out that part of the purpose of today is that analog formats are also fragile and also subject to loss. And at this point in time, we don't have any greater worries about loss of digital than we do the loss of our physical format material. But we do need systems that are incredibly robust around preservation so that we can put our hands on our hearts into the future and say the electronic record that someone is looking at is exactly the same as it was when we were collected. We risk an enormous questions of trust in the records that we create if we don't have robust cybersecurity around our most precious collections. But I think I'll go to that fundamentally our largest issues in thinking the future of this actually do come to the fact that the way that we produce, consume, share ideas and content is changing. And we need a conceptual shift among cultural institutions about what cultural memory is and how we can collect it in order to move forward. Funding is a part of that picture, without question. And part of that decline in the public space, in Australia at least, has also led to a decline in the investment of Commonwealth public funding into institutions like the library. I do want to mediate that by pointing out that the National Library has a mixed view on this. Trove was an enormous risk for our institution at the time that we set it up. It was a commitment of extra expenditure at the time when we had very little to go around. But we have received extra support to special funding for Trove in the last few budgets to make sure we can sustain the service, thanks to both community and to government support. But we still don't have a long-term solution in place. And this endless growth in our mandate and the need to challenge those difficult questions across the NCIs has not been met with a funding solution that would enable us to do that. But funding alone isn't the solution. Like Jackie, I have a great deal of optimism. Digital offers spectacular opportunities for collaboration. The National eDeposit Service, and I can see some of my collaborators in that service, through which the Commonwealth and state libraries collaboratively collect digital publications and then make them accessible, because you can do that digitally. We no longer need to gatekeep our collections in the same way between us. Has been a huge exemplar of how we can use digital to work faster and smarter. But most of all, I think some of the work that Craig's talking about also does steer us towards a different future. We can use this collaboration to collaborate with our audiences, to think differently about how we describe, we manage, we understand what we're collecting, to give ourselves the capacity not just to have a single view or to reduce what we do down to a set of something we take and something we give back. We have the capacity here to create entirely new relationships with audiences that both build and curate collections at the same time. And at that point, I will stop. Thank you very much.